This is Metro Week, our top story bringing water to desert crossers. We'll talk to the man who started putting water tanks in southern Arizona to save migrants' lives. Then our Journalists Roundtable analyzes the week's news.
Welcome to Metro Week. I'm Andrea Kelly. Humanitarian organizations have been placing barrels of water in the desert for migrants for 15 years now. The goal is to reduce the numbers of deaths, now counting into the thousands recorded in that time, as undocumented immigrants traverse the dangerous terrain and climate. We'll begin with a look at the water station's beginnings. Humane Borders started the work in 2001, deploying 65-gallon drums because the organization says it observed that most deaths in the desert were from dehydration. The organization's website says it has dispensed more than 100,000 gallons of water, using thousands of volunteers in the past 15 years. Just as back then, today each station is painted blue, with the word agua on the sides and a blue flag which rises 30 feet in the air to signal its presence. Over the years, water drums have been targets of opposition and vandalism. The Pima County Board of Supervisors has provided funding annually to Humane Borders, and at least one board member has objected, saying phones in the desert would be a better solution to get people help and medical aid. Other supervisors say it saves money by preventing deaths that the county medical examiner's office would otherwise spend money investigating. Now we'll hear from the man who started this project. Reverend Robin Hoover shared the story of getting the first and then many other water tanks into the desert. Take us back 15 years. Why did you start this work?
15 years ago, some of the humanitarian kinds of folks and border interest folks started observing the rising number of migrant deaths that were occurring, being reported. They were very small in number, but it was enough to agitate us. And so on June 11th, 2000, about 85 people gathered at the Pima Friends Meeting House, and we founded an organization called Humane Borders. We said we wanted to put water out in the desert, and we wanted to advocate for changes in U.S. immigration policies. It took us several months, up until November of that year, to put out our very first water station. It was a short-lived private property experiment. But on March 7th, 2001, we deployed our first two water stations at Oregon Pipe Cactus National Monument. Prior to that, we had to design them, obtain permits, put out insurance policies. We had to do all kinds of things. Each water station was insured for $1 million, as if that little plastic barrel was going to cause that much damage. We never figured that one out. So anyway, we deployed those stations, and immediately we began deploying other water stations. In April of that year, we were talking to Cabeza Prieta National Wildlife Refuge leaders and applying to deploy water in their non-wilderness areas over there. In April, they turned down that permit, and on May 23, 14 migrants out of one group of 26 all perished, and they all walked within 3/4 of a mile of one of our proposed sites. And so this thing went meteoric, it went worldwide. Soon after that, within a year and a half, we reached 106 stations that were operating.
Now, you've mentioned some of the public land that they're on. Are there any on private land?
There's water on federal, state, tribal, county, city, and private properties.
So you need permits for the government-owned, and then you just apparently need permission from the property owners?
The other people finally replicated the same policy, and so our insurance had to cover all of the operations, and each station was created and duplicated in the same way to operate, and we would provide private landowners the equipment that they needed to operate a station themselves.
How have you been able to tell through the years whether this is working?
We know from a major study that was done at the Applied Spatial Analysis Center, I think is the name of it, here at the University of Arizona, that the presence of the water stations is statistically significant in reducing the deaths. We also know that by our presence of the volunteers in the desert and the number of encounters that we had through the 15 years of operations, that we saved a lot of folks. We even saved the lives of some U.S. citizens.
You helped start Humane Borders, which started the desert water stations. You're not with them anymore. Are they still carrying on the stations?
I left years ago. Humane Borders is a much smaller organization now, operating about 35 water stations.
What was the peak number when you were there?
106.
Okay. Then how can you tell, with immigration, immigration varies, right? And it's been down in recent years. So what were those studies looking at that actually proved that these water stations work?
Oh, they simply, that's a very complex statistical model, and I have a PhD in political science, and they trained us in all those methodologies. But they take a large area out there, and then they take these arbitrary assigned points, and then they measure the distance to the deaths, et cetera. And so if you have stations there, you have far fewer deaths anywhere near in the area. But a lot of this is changing because where the migrants across is changing. We're seeing a much more westward movement of the migration from Altar and Caborca out to Sonoita. We're starting to see a scarily drastic rise in the number of deaths occurring at Organ Pipe Cactus National Monument, Cabeza Preta Refuge, Ahu Block of the BLM, western side of the Tonatum Reservation, and the Barium Goldwater Air Force Range. That is really scary to us because there are insufficient presence of water there, and these deaths are preventable, they're predictable. We should be managing these things. If these deaths were taking place in an urban environment, the locals would be screaming. We have become inured to the problem because we have about the same number of deaths every year. But the problem is, if you measure that, there's far fewer people coming now. In fact, we have a negative migration, but we have a rate that's like 5 times what it was 10 years ago.
So if someone wanted to put more tanks out in Organ Pipe National Park or National Monument to do that, who pays for this?
Well, it's an extremely difficult and complex situation. It took a long time to achieve each one of those locations and to have a specific permit. So a group would have to approach them, comply with all of the regulations, et cetera. What would be better, in our opinion today, for migrant status is if the federal land managers would simply operate their own polyethylene tanks and fill them up, put out big tanks that wouldn't have to service them so often. It would just be a much simpler operation. We've tried to teach them how to do this. In 2010, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service that operates Cabeza Preta National Wildlife Refuge and the Buenos Aires National Wildlife Refuge did a study, and they said, this is the way to do it. Put you a tank above ground, mark it with the flag, service it periodically, make sure it's chlorinated so that there's nothing growing in it, and that would take care of business. They could do that themselves. It's very simple.
What's the likelihood of that happening, in your opinion?
Well, who knows? It's a political thing. We need to create a political environment in which we have an expectation that the people who operate our lands are going to do so in such a way that does not have such a deleterious impact on human life.
Now, we can't talk about these water stations without talking about the opponents
Sure.
who say that they just increase migration or allow, it's permissive. It allows people
There's
to go through
zero
the desert.
evidence of that because we can take corridor for corridor. When we deployed, we had 14 stations in the Altar Aravaca Valley, for instance, at one time. But when we deployed all of those, there was no change in the apprehension rate or in the, which we used as a surrogate measure for who was coming. So there's no indication whatsoever. They would have to show me some data.
So you helped start this program,
Yes.
but you're not presently involved in it.
That's correct.
Okay, so
we are, though, monitoring migrant activities in the West Desert and monitoring water operations.
Go into some detail. What does that mean?
Well, we have permission to be on several of these properties and just find out where migrant trash is, where the trails are, what's happening, are they walking, where the water is currently deployed, yes, no, those kinds of things. So we're doing an analysis. We're in the infancy stage of that.
And where do you hope that leads?
Well, I hope it leads to a very detailed conversations with some of the land managers out there so that collectively people can bring resources and knowledge and our background together in a way that we can reduce the number of deaths out there. It's not in an adversarial relationship with law enforcement, but it is in a hope that we can save lives and save resources because this is a significant demand on the resources of Pima County, for instance.
And that's because the medical examiner's office deals with the deaths. The
Well,
bodies.
you have admissions to University Medical Center, Banner. You have the medical examiner has to treat each one of these as if it were a crime first, and then they have to try to identify the body and the autopsies and so forth. It gets very complicated.
What other solutions are there on the horizon? Is there anything other than putting water in the desert?
Of course there is. I mean, part of our mission when we decided to put water in the desert was to help teach the United States how to do politics a little bit differently. And for 15 years, we advocated for providing a legal status for people to come here and a legal status for the people who are here. There are ways to do that that are far less controversial than what you hear national candidates talk about. First of all, you can provide long-term visas for the people that are already here based upon interviews and background checks. It's not a true legalization program. It does not have to lead to citizenship. That's a political football that somebody else can play with. And then we need to provide visas for people from Mexico, Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, et cetera. A few of our southern neighbors, I'll just say it that way. We need to exempt them from the worldwide quota of visas, figure out who they are, get them certified even before they come up and apply for a visa, allow them to work in the United States, have them post a bond in effect, and 10% of their gross goes into that for the period of the visa that might be 24 or 36 months. They pick up their money and they go home. We'll be transferring billions of dollars over a long period of time to our southern neighbors. They're going to spend the money in Walmart Corporation and which is the largest corporation in Mexico. And if you travel down any street in Mexico City, you see nothing but U.S. franchises. So the money's going to go back into U.S. companies and go into retirement plans, et cetera. It's a way of exporting skills, knowledge, ability, English proficiency, integrating our economies. It is not in our long-term interest to have poor neighbors, and it's not in any interest that we have whatsoever to see the migration continue the way it is. Let me say one thing. Currently, the plan is to make it as physically difficult as possible to come here. So we create walls, we put up sensors, we do towers, we do all kinds of things. We destroy the environment when we do that, and we end up killing people that are trying to avoid that infrastructure. We make it financially expensive to get here. And in the process of doing that over the last decade and a half, we have transferred billions of dollars to the cartel that move people instead of drugs. That's, why give money to our enemies? That doesn't make any sense. And then the cartels treat them like a commodity, so that results in deaths. And then finally, we're pushing people into the most inhospitable areas of the desert, and that just literally kills people. This is the result of congressional testimony by the Commissioner of Customs and Border Protection. I didn't make this up. Those are our current strategies, and we need to have law enforcement is not the answer.
Are you working on any political efforts directly to change those policies?
I occasionally do some lobbying, and I've been involved in a C-SPAN thing that was televised directly from one of the congressional office buildings a while back, where I said death is now part of the instrument of U.S. policy, and we need to change that. So yes, I'm involved in some advocacy, and I also lecture in universities.
All right, Reverend Robin Hoover, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Lorraine Rivera. Tonight on Arizona Week, Mexico's Secretary of Foreign Affairs makes a visit to Tucson.
Divisiveness is not the way to create prosperity, and both the American people and the Mexican people, we want to grow.
Now our journalist roundtable. Joining me in the studio today, Tim Steller of the Arizona Daily Star, Michelle Morisco of the Fronteras Desk, and Dylan Smith of the Tucson Sentinel. Thanks for all of you for coming in today. Dylan, I'm going to start with you, and we're going to talk about the water stations a little longer. Have you seen the study that Reverend Hoover referenced showing that the stations prevent deaths? Have you seen any data that aligns with that?
I've looked at a number of different studies over the years. They've done a few as they've gathered all of the data over the past decade and a half about first where to place these stations and then sort of trying to track if they are effective. And really at this point, we've reached the point where the patterns of migration have changed. The routes that people are taking through the desert are not quite where the water stations are anymore because they were placed, many of them the spots were picked fairly close to roads, near washes, where people were going 15 years ago. So I don't think they are as effective at this point at preventing deaths as they may have been a while back.
And then, Michelle, another aspect to that conversation is not just that maybe the routes have changed, but also the number of people crossing through the desert has changed. How has that trend changed over the 15 years?
There's two dynamics that are really important when you're talking about migrant deaths and the number of deaths. First of all, when we talk about the people who died in the desert, we don't know how many. We know how many have been found. And it's a really crucial difference because occasionally there are skeletal remains found in the desert that may have been there a year, 2 years.
10 years.
10 years, this changes everything. When you're trying to get a good view of the totality of just how many people have died. When it comes to the number of people compared to the number of people who've been crossing the border, the number of people who have been crossing the border has been dropping, but the number of deaths has stayed about the same. And this suggests that perhaps many of these people are an increasing number of fresh deportees who lived primarily in the United States, have ties here, have connections here, maybe have very little tie back to Latin America where they were born, but were deported back and then attempted to come in. This has happened a few times.
When they get deported, do they get deported to northern Mexico, making it easier to try and come back?
Some of them do. Some of them are back onto the interior repatriation flights that DHS runs with the government of Mexico, but then many of those people still keep coming home. This is home for them.
And Dylan, these water barrels, the 15th anniversary is potentially a notable anniversary, but also one of them is going to the Smithsonian to become part of an exhibition. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, it's going to the Cooper Hewitt Design Museum in New York City, which is part of the Smithsonian Institution. And they have an exhibit going on that is, not really industrial design like so much of what they do. It's more about designs for social problems and the physical manifestations of how people approach that. And so this is a very small, concrete example that's sort of almost more symbolic of what is going on here in the desert. But in and of itself, it's a fairly compact design approach to solving this problem in that it's easy to move around.
And Tim, presumably part of drawing the attention to the 15th anniversary, which Reverend Hoover was doing this week, was to gain public attention for it. Do you think a lot of the public, people watching this show or reading the papers, are aware of these issues or are still kind of in tune with this part of an immigration discussion?
I'm sure people are aware, yeah, but the thing that's changed is that sense of crisis that was occurring back 2000, 1999, 2001, when this was occurring. I remember vividly in June 2000, which was not coincidentally the month when this meeting happened that brought Humane Borders to life, getting a call from someone I knew at the consulate saying, Tim, they're dropping like flies all over the place. And that weekend there were separately like 12 to 15 deaths just in this area. And that was the period when things really exploded into our consciousness. And of course, now that the flow is lower and the deaths are lower, yeah, it doesn't have the sense of crisis like it once did. But sure, it's still a problem, no question.
Do you have something to add?
There's definitely, I'm always struck by how the number of deaths hasn't really changed. What has changed is the number of incidences. I remember these days that Tim is talking about when, you'd come in on a Monday morning after being off all weekend, and there would have been 15 people who have died over the past 2-3 days. And of course, there was the Yuma 14, the 14 who died in the Cabeza Preta National Wildlife Refuge out of a total, I think, 26 who attempted to cross that week. These large numbers aren't happening anymore. And yet we're still facing 140, 150, upwards of 230 people a year who are just found just here in southern Arizona. The headlines are gone, the sense of crisis he's talking about, and yet the numbers they haven't changed that much.
Of course, as you said, there's a question about whether the numbers are reflecting current deaths or whether they're reflecting just a lot of people being out and finding bones, right. The bones that may have been there a long time.
Questions we aren't going to find the answer to for a while, I think. We won't know the answer to the deaths, but also the relationship to crossings is not easily discoverable. Michelle, you have spent some time in Mexico this past week and obviously also over your career. And I want to talk about some of the changes you noticed in the city of Hermosillo. What was different when you were there now compared to several years ago?
I spent some time in Hermosillo, the capital of the state of Sonora, this past week working on a story for the Fronteras desk. And the city has just been decimated. I mean, right now, Mexico's peso is upwards of 17 to 1 when there were years that it was as low as 12 and 13 to $1. So right now, it has so little value. When you're driving through, Hermosillo is the capital. There's 750,000 people who live there. And when you're driving through, there are entire hotels and empty buildings that are collapsing, that are for rent, that are for sale, and clearly nobody's buying. And this is down not on the outskirts of the city, but right down what used to be the gem, the main boulevard leading right down to the cathedral and city hall. And I would say just in driving up and down that area while I was interviewing different sources, a good third of the major buildings are either broken down, falling apart, missing windows, rotting masonry, or up for sale. And it was really struck because this was a city that for many years really prided itself on being a jewel for the country. I don't know what that's going to mean in a broader context, but I do question whether or not Tucson is going to continue investing in advertising for Hermosillo to keep bringing people up here. Because the other thing I noticed is that there isn't as much advertising along the main avenues for Park Place Mall, Foothills Mall, and these were very targeted ad campaigns that the city used to develop in Hermosillo. That's definitely changed.
And that kind of strikes me because Dylan and Tim, Tim and Dylan, I looked at the wrong people. We've talked about so many efforts from the city to be expanding business relationships into Mexico and Mexican business relationships into the U.S. So what kind of an impact do you think that what Michelle observed this week has on those current efforts on this side of the border?
Well, obviously, if the peso buys so much less in Tucson or the United States, then that means that people who earn their money in pesos won't have as much purchasing power up here. It's going to Target or wherever you may see people from Sonora, and so that's going to obviously hurt as long as the peso is that low. I think the other level, though, I mean, the retail level is one thing, but the other level that we're talking about is cross-border investments like the big Ford plant that's there, some aerospace companies. I don't know, did you get a sense as to how they're doing those bigger investments as opposed to kind of the street level building?
Those bigger investments are doing really well, and they've been doing. There's been a lot of investment coming in from the United States, for example, on the Ford plant. Cemex, the enormous industrial company that's ostensibly owned by the country of Mexico, is doing incredibly well. I question where's that wealth going, because it's not spilling out into the streets of Hermosillo. And that was a striking difference.
A lot of that is funded with U.S. dollars. So if the peso is weak, that makes it easier to funnel dollars there. They're worth more. So if we see less retail impact here in Tucson, but we might see a big bump in that sort of goods flowing north from Mexico because they're easy for us to buy.
Right. And of course, there's also the port of entry question, where just this week, John McCain finally met with Jay Johnson from Homeland Security to talk about why is a major port like the Mariposa port of entry being understaffed. Just coming through yesterday, 12 brand new lanes, multi-million-dollar port, 7 lanes open, 7 lanes closed, 5 lanes open.
And
that's a problem.
That's common when you go through there. Come on.
Yeah, they spend a lot of money to get those extra lanes, and
they sit there unused, and we have the huge problem of people just backed up at the border.
Yeah,
and who's going to cross if it takes that?
And not only that, but then this trade that you're talking about going elsewhere, which was the whole argument for it in the first place.
It makes it that much more difficult to actually find the pretty blatant attempts to smuggle drugs at the border crossing, because the people working them are so stressed trying to process people through.
And that's the bottom line, right? This is a staffing issue.
Yes.
They're not able to find enough.
It's a hiring issue.
And they've done job fairs and all kinds of things.
They do job fairs. They're supposed to be looking at veterans, specifically Jobs for Veterans Act, but they're just really slow to hire. Don't know what their holdup is. Now, the question's going to become, and Dylan alluded to this earlier, I think of those ports of entry in Texas that are trying to become funded by the municipal and city governments in that area. What's that going to do to Mariposa? Because right now, for example, the Santa Cruz Port Authority doesn't actually have a dog in the fight. They're not hiring inspectors themselves. But if Texas can get it together, that could have a huge impact on our biggest shipping port here.
And shipping, doing more shipping through Texas.
Exactly.
Yeah.
All right, I'm sure we're going to stay on this topic for years to come, but for now I'm going to switch to the new proposed budget for the Tucson Police Department. And Dylan, why don't you just first kind of summarize what the big issues in this proposal are?
Of course, there are a whole lot of moving parts to this, but the bottom line is basically, at least for the time being, significantly reducing the size of the Tucson Police Department and taking a number of officers and detectives off of special assignments that they've been working on and basically putting them back out into the streets on patrol to try and actually the spin coming out of TPD is we will see more officers on the streets. We don't quite know if that's the case. Some of the numbers are a little bit fuzzy. In fact, even just trying to get the actual current staffing level of TPD has been something they've been, a little reluctant to talk about. So we don't really know how many fewer officers we will have, but the initial reduction is supposed to be about $14 million. But about $7 million of that will be turned back into other programs, new police cars, uniforms, technology, things like that. So towards our remaining city deficit of about $26 million, there'll be about $7 million taken out of that TPD.
And that's the core of the decision, right?
Yes.
There has to be $25 million cut from the city budget, and so this is just one of the places.
From all of the departments are looking at some seeing what their options are for some pretty drastic cuts, and then some of the proposed cuts for TPD internally were much more severe than what we're looking at now, and I think we're going to see that across the board, across the city.
And you mentioned some of the uncertainties about how this plan will actually play out, and while more officers on the street sounds great, I mean, who doesn't want that? Potentially, some of those support staff roles are important in that to those street officers. So how missing support roles to add patrol officers, that's unsure how that's going to play out.
And it's really dependent. Our new police chief, Chief Chris Magnus, said they won't be laying anybody off, at least from sworn officers. They're relying on attrition. So how rapidly we hit those targets is something really dependent on how quickly people retire. We see a pretty steady rate of about 6 officers a month who retire, so it's going to take about a year to get down to the target that they're looking at. So there's a lot of wiggle room across the whole plan.
And so one interesting part of the background here is the political side. Of course, this is a proposal that would be part of the city's budget going forward in the coming fiscal year. And I have to wonder, though, there's also been talk of a sales tax increase or some other tax increase that would
almost a promise, I would say, not just
very
talk.
close, yeah. And so if we do increase the sales tax by 0.5 cent, which is one proposal out there, then that would, of course, take some of the urgency or the need for some of these cuts off the table. I almost wonder whether these proposals aren't part of a longer-term game of selling a tax increase in the future. In other words, you say, well, people, we got to cut police unless you pass a sales tax.
And the mayor has been very clear that he wants to put some sort of a tax increase on the November ballot, which really is not that long away. So if you start to feel these impacts, that's an interesting point.
And they're not above using these cuts in almost, I don't want to say a threatening manner, but definitely a leverage manner.
Yes.
I'll go back to last year when it was revealed that Tucson police officers had been visiting these illicit massage parlors throughout the city. At the time, Roberto Villaseñor came out to say, look, we had budget cuts, and as a result, our vice unit wasn't fully staffed. That's why they was so slow to investigate this prostitution ring. In fact, it was the alcohol beverage control people who ended up finding it illicitly or initially. And our vice unit wasn't what it was because we had all these budget cuts because you, the taxpayers, wanted to save money. So when I think about it now, and what Dylan is talking about and what Tim's talking about with the sales tax, it's like, yeah, they've done this before.
All right, well, that's definitely something we're going to keep watching as we go. Thanks for all of you for coming in today. As always, you can find stories from the AZPM newsroom on our website. Next week, we'll cover the dropping rate of homelessness in the metro area as Vanessa Barchfield looks at some of the resources available for people who are homeless. Thanks for watching.